Welcome back. This is week 7, lecture 2, Socialism, Communism, and the Common Man. And this lecture follows naturally upon the previous lecture dealing with the Industrial Revolution, as we saw and as discussed. And in some ways, it's the reaction to industrialization and the concept of laissez-faire capitalism in the vein of Adam Smith, as we talked about. Now, with Smith and the laissez-faire concept, for Smith, in this enlightened, rational view, the guiding hand, so to speak, would take care of everything. And it would all work out, so to speak, for the good of all. That means not only for Smith and Smith's conception, for the capitalists, those who owned the capital and were making the wealth, but also for the labor. Because in perfect competition, it all has a way of bringing about the best for all. Now, I could go into examples there that we could have to see the extent to which, in a rational sense, that is theoretically perhaps not invalid or even true, so to speak. The problem is, as I mentioned, that perfect competition does not exist. This is not a perfect world, and even very small little differences. I think I used the example of a coffee shop on one side of the street, and on the other side, in terms of meridian, where you stop and all those things, the morning flow of traffic, means that it's not equal. It's not the same. And so the point is also in terms of abilities and ideas and everything else, energy, all these different factors come into play that render perfect competition a fiction. And once there is a flaw in the perfection, once there is imperfect competition, that leads to all kinds of potential problems. And the profit motive that was based on Smith's understanding of laissez-faire capitalism, with capital making capital, the whole point is to increase your wealth, to maximize profits. It is based on individual self-interest, whether that individual self-interest is the capitalist himself, and I say him because at this time there were no women who were factory owners or capitalists, um, or for the corporation as such. And so it is this concept of the profit is what matters. And I think I also mentioned that led to this sense of a shift in the determination of values, and what is valuable or what is valued is what is valuable in terms of monetary wealth. And so the more money you have, the more you're seen as a valuable person for society. And that shift to monetary measuring of value, not just wealth, but value, which was related to virtue and everything else, leads to a very problematic ethical result when there began to be obvious abuses of, I won't say the system because the system was actually working, but of people, where people were being used for the profit of others. Now, that began to be recognized and seen as a problem. What do we do about it? And the response, in some ways, was socialism, communism, and concern for the common man. Now, the common man is a concept that goes back to the Reformation. And I think I may have mentioned this. I can't say for sure. I certainly talk about it in my Reformation class and usually in Western Civ 1 when I talk about these topics. The so-called revolution or of 1525, the peasant wars of 1525, were seen as the revolution of the common man. And there's a whole kind of approach to Reformation called the Reformation of the common man, the Gemeinde Reformation, the community Reformation, based on this concept of the common man. Now, in the 16th century, who was the common man? The common man were all those people who were not nobles or clergymen, or let's say, especially in the 16th century, wealthy merchants and bankers and such. So that kind of that other aspects in terms of society, not in terms of the legal structure where we have, the first order or the first estate, the nobles, those who fight, the second, those who pray, the clergy, and then the third, the peasants, those who work, everybody else. But with the rise of merchants and banking and trade, we have extremely wealthy individuals who are more wealthy than some of the lower level nobles and the nobility. And so, but even though they're still legally classified as peasants. Now, we talked about that too in terms of the French Revolution and what was going on there in terms of the shift from voting based on orders or estates to individual representation. But here, the common man doesn't really include that upper level peasantry, the wealthy, non noble aristocracy, is essentially. So we have the nobles, the aristocracy, but it is that next level, the common person, the workers, the regular people. That's the common man. Not so much the serfs, certainly not the slaves, who were increasingly, of course, in the 16th, 17th century, coming about, especially in the colonies and so. But it was let's say, your average person, your average Joe is your common man. That concept continued. And in some ways, the French Revolution was too a revolution of the common man, that we should have representation based on population, not based on this categorization of where we plug you into the social hierarchy. Now, that focus on the common people, which is an abstraction, right? Because even within that group of common people, there's a lot of diversity and differences. But as a group, as a category, we're talking about the non-aristocratic, or let's say the non-capitalist. We're talking about the non-noble, and we're not talking about the clergy. So the problem was, what was the effects of industrialization on the common man, which still comprised the majority of the population? And the abuses of this system based on greed and the maximization of profits of the common man became increasingly apparent. And the question is what to do about it. Now, the terms socialism and communism, as they are used today, especially in popular culture and popular political discourse, have little to do with the actual historical developments of socialism and then of communism. They're misunderstandings, and often socialism and communism are seen as basically the same, which they are definitely not, or were definitely not in the historical development. In some ways, the problem all came about, at least this association. This is me just speculating and throwing it out there, with the Russian Revolution, which we'll be talking about a little bit later in the course. We have a revolutionary movement that throws out the monarch, the czar, and establishes a new society based on the ideas of Karl Marx. So here's almost a third ism that is thrown into it, Marxism. And I'll be talking about Marx today. That's actually the part of the reading for this week is reading selections, snippets from Marx's works. That is posted there. There's a huge distinction to make between Marx and Karl Marx's own thoughts and policies and principles and ideas, and then what was made of them and how they were used, i.e., Marxism. And what happened with the Industrial Revolution, or not the Industrial Revolution, excuse me, the Russian Revolution, was that this new government and organization of society that was established, I'll be talking a lot more about this when we get there, was attempted to base itself on Marxist ideas and Marxist principles, Marxist theories, but then actually implementing it and making it into a practical approach in society. And we'll see that problem when we get with later on in this lecture when we talk about Marx. And what was formed was the Union of Socialist Soviet Republics, the USSR, which was then communistic, and that it was communism based on actually I'm not going to say a perversion of Marx, but a understanding of Marx and how it all came about and what Marx was actually arguing and advocating for. And so that is the association of socialism, the socialist republics, with communism as the form of government and society. But we'll talk about that and try to unpack those things as we go along. But the point I want you to get and grasp and say, okay, whatever in the common political discourse that's out there, so to speak, these terms that are thrown around, they don't reflect the historical development. Socialism as such is simply social consciousness and awareness, and having the government attempt to somehow mitigate the abuses of the common man of capitalism. And so any type of government program is socialistic in that sense. So Social Security is socialism. Actually, income tax is socialism. In some ways, the military is somewhat, I mean, taxes are not really socialism, but welfare program is certainly socialistic. Medicaid and Medicare are socialistic. Um, the freeway system basically is socialism at work. The national government providing for the needs of the people is within that definition of a socialist approach to society, whereby the government needs to, again, to regulate and to somehow fine tune and compensate for the lack of perfect competition within a capitalist society. Now, within that context, there are various levels, of let's say socialistic programs. Of course, we can say that the U.S. is socialistic in some ways. It's not a socialist system, whereas in like Canada and many of the European countries are far more socialistic than are the United States, even though there's still democratic governments based on capitalism. The issue is, what do we do with capitalism? How do we rein in its more, let's say, unsavory aspects that come about because pure competition does not exist? So the whole idea of laissez-faire, just letting it all be, and the government keep your hands off of it, results in all kinds of problems and also social problems. And that all became beginning to become apparent in the early 19th century, especially in England, which was kind of the home of the Industrial Revolution, where it really got started and took off. And a number of attempts to address the issue were proposed. And all based on this heightened awareness of social consciousness of what was happening to the common people, and then the response thereof and based thereon of social activism, that we have to somehow step in and do something. And in this next slide, I have social consciousness and social activism. I begin with child labor laws, because I talked about the factory and the influence of the factory and impact of the factory on the family, and the kind of emergence of the wage laborer and then the urban poor. And if you have mother and father going into the factory to work long hours, which I'll get to, what do you do with the kids? Well, childcare is not available, so often you put them to work too. And for the capitalists, this is great. You get, you can pay kids, a pittance of what you have to pay an adult. And so if you can get child labor and maximize child labor, that will increase your profits. Or so the thought was. And so children, even young children, were being forced to work in factories. And in some of these factories, textile factories primarily, but other types as well, you have abuses. And that was seen by British Victorian society. Now, the whole concept of Victorian England is problematic. You maybe heard of the Victorian, prim and proper Victorian England, named after Queen Victoria, the longest reigning monarch, I think, before Elizabeth I. It was a real force. And Victorian England is a fascinating period of contradictions. And a lot of study has been gone on to show that these prim and proper, the moralists of Victorian England, were anything but in private, where vice ran rampant underneath this facade of prim and properness. But that distinction was a problem because prim and properness, we don't treat kids like this. We don't want to think about it and treat it. We don't want to um, have the feeling that our society allows for the destitution of its people. And here, I mean, in the act of the process of making them destitute. This is where, too, we have the poor laws, we have the debtor's prison, and it really became this massive problem. And we think we have a problem today with homelessness, and we do. What do we do with the homeless? And how do we solve that problem? Do we say, well, it's all because their own fault, because they're lazy, they don't go out and get jobs? Um, is it because of jobs not being available? Is it because they've been taken advantage of or whatever? What is the basis and cause of homelessness, and then what to do about it? Should the government step in? Should we just get them off the street and put them in prisons or holding cells or something? That is a similar problem that the British had in the early first decades of the 19th century. Not so much with homelessness as we think about, but with the destitute and the poor, and with realizing what is going on here. The family unit of what we traditionally thought of was the basis of society was being broken asunder completely by the objectification of labor and turning workers into wage laborers, where they're not not benefiting the fruits of their labor. They're simply paid. That this alienation of the wage laborer now from the fruits of their labor. This became to be a problem. And the Parliament said we should at least look into this. And so they had, I think it's Robert Sadler, did an investigation and did a report, started interviewing a lot of people, children too, to find out what's really going on in the factories. And this Sadler report was damning and somewhat shocking, where you have young children, 6, 7, 8 years old, 9 years old, working, 12, 15 hours a day in factories. And the reports of abuse, because if they were, dozed off and were falling asleep on the job, at least in one factory where Sadler interviewed a number of people, they were whipped to keep them going, to keep them working. No education, very little to eat, nutrition, long hours. They finally get home and then they have to get up early to go back to make it on time the next day, because if they're not on time to start work, they get beaten again, whipped. Not a good look. Shocking to the moral sensitivity of the time, and the issue is what to do about it. Now, other studies, even at the time, but then scholars have also shown other investigations, demonstrated that the Sadler report, let's say, is one of the most extreme reports. That these were not the conditions everywhere, but in general, the problem was young children working long hours, no um, no schooling, which is a problem, and still unhealthy conditions, even if they're not being whipped, even if there's somewhat more understanding of the needs of children in order to extract the labor from them. And so the real abuses that are detailed and documented in the Sadler report are not the whole story, but yet still it was shocking to the British sensitivities. Look at what we're doing. Look at the effects of what we thought was this great development of industrialization, the factory and production and wealth, but at what cost? And the Sadler Report came out in 1832, and in 1833, Parliament passed the Factory Act of 1833. And if we go to that next slide, I have the conclusions of the Factory Act in terms of the statutes that were established. Just look at these here. No child workers under 9 years of age. So all of a sudden they said, you can't have 8-year-olds working 12-hour days. So no children under the age of 9 can work in the factory, which means that number one, it was going on. Number two, that if you're a 9-year-old, great, you can still work. Just think about that today. What do we think of 9, 10, 11-year-olds? Should they be able to work full days, 6, 7 days a week? Now, they said no child workers under 9 years of age, and then to ensure that employers must have an age certificate for their child workers, meaning any worker under 18, they had to have documentation of their age. Then they limited the amount of child labor. So children between the ages of 9 and 13 could not work more than 9 hours a day. Think about that. A 9-year-old could be working in the factory for 9 hours a day. That's huge. And that does not include breaks. You see later on in the stipulation, they get 2 hours of schooling. That is not counted in those 9 hours. It's burdensome. That was what was going on in that stipulation, that no one under the age of 9 could work, meant that 9-year-olds were working. And that was okay. This is an attempt to make things better for children. And then they stipulate children 9 to 13 years of work or years can only work 9 hours a day. But children 13 to 18 years could only work up to 12 hours a day. Now, once you get to be 17, 18, you're physically sort of almost an adult. And so an 18-year-old working 12 hours is like, okay, that's a lot of work. That's really hard work. But a 12-year-old, a 13-year-old, a 14-year-old working 12-hour days in conditions that weren't all that great. So you can see as we go through these statutes, the sanitary conditions really aren't addressed necessarily. The issues of potential sex abuse, which we know from the Stadler report was rampant, at least in this one factory, was not really addressed. So it's not saying that this is making everything nice and dandy, but it's limiting how much children could work, which implies, as the reports, the Stadler report and others indicate, that they were working more than that. So from 13 to 18, you could not work more than 12 hours a day. And children, i.e. 18 and under, could not work at night. So that means from sunup to sundown. You can say, well, wait a minute, what about different times of the years? Do we really have 12 days of 12 hours of daylight for a lot of the year in England? It's like, no, we don't. But that's not the issue. The issue is, I don't know if can't tell you how they defined night here, but it's probably between 6 and 6, if I had to guess, or 6 and 10 or something. So still, they're trying to limit it. And then they say 2 hours of schooling each day for children. So all of a sudden we have mandated schooling. Now, in the United States, the public education movement was really also 19th century, but a little bit later on in the 1850s, 1860s, I think, I forget exactly. But it was not always mandatory that children go to school whatsoever. And that was a slow development for the state to step in and say, children must go to school, and we will provide schools for them, public education. It even doesn't really get going until the 20th century, early 20th century in the United States. But that's a socialist program. It is, with the government saying this is in the national interest to force, to the extent that we can, children to go to school to learn. That kind of starts as a response to the Industrial Revolution. Because if we have children working, 9 to 12 hours a day with no schooling. And then what? They turn 19 and they just continue then working 16 hours a day? As adults, they can't read, they can't write. What do? It turns workers into slaves, even if not technically. The factory owners didn't own their workers, but in terms of how they were treated as commodities, treated as commodities to be used and replaced when necessary. And the problem was population is expanding at this time. And so there was more labor seeking work than there were jobs being offered, and that causes a problem. And that, going back to Adam Smith's perfect competition, it would actually all work out. And so if there was a factory that was having unsafe working conditions, or too long of hours or whatever, other factories would not be that way. So the competition would work out that factory who was, let's say, exploiting its workers, and especially the children workers and child labor, would not be successful because people would not want to work there because there would be other options. But when you have a glut of the labor market, employers can say, okay, I'll pay you as low as possible. We'll talk more about that shortly. So that was what was going on in terms of that. So 2 hours of schooling each, and then 4 factory inspectors appointed to enforce the law. There were 4 government officials to say, we are going to make sure and go around to the factories to see that this is the case. And that's why factory owners had to have certificates of the children's ages who were working there, etc., because this is just not acceptable. That was the first really attempt by the British government to say, okay, we need to do something to mitigate the abuses of the capitalist system when we simply have hands-off approach and let these capitalists, the factory owners, the factory managers, maximize their profits in whatever way they possibly can for their own benefit and or for the benefit of their share owners, their investors, to the exclusion of the workers. Now, other ideas came along with that too. And I have up here Robert Owen's essays on the principle of formation of the human character, 1813 1816. Owens, very interesting individual, and we talk about Owenism in England, definitely a socialist approach. And the idea was that we can improve human character. We can improve human character if we improve the conditions in which humans have to live. Owens was a Scottish capitalist, industrialist, but he realized, exploiting labor is not the most effective use of labor. If we can have healthy, happy, moral workers, our production will actually increase. And he started a program of providing for his workers, and he established these communities in Scotland, but also in England. When I was in England, in Liverpool, we went and visited one called Sunshine. They're like regulated communities where workers could live together as families in community. They were provided with sufficient food, with education, with entertainment, with religious instruction, because on the outside, this seemed to be a great deal. It allowed people to live healthy lives. It also dictated, let's say, the morality of the community. So there was very little freedom. And if you were fortunate enough to be able to live in one of these communities, you had to follow the rules. And if you didn't, you were kicked out. That was a problem. So it's this kind of positive negatives. But Owen's whole idea was, let's say, social engineering in some ways, that we can make people better people if we give them the conditions in which to live in a decent way, rather than in squalor and in poverty, malnourished, fending for themselves as they have to trudge into the factory and be beaten and subjected to all kinds of issues. So this idea is we can make things better. And based on how we step in and organize labor, or the common man, organize labor, we will also improve their moral quality. So we'll be more in keeping with the overarching national ideals of what civilized Victorian society should be. Now, this was an experiment, and it worked to a degree. Certainly, I mean, it's called Sunshine in England, and they made sunshine soap and everything else, and it was great. Um, it looked like it'd be really nice, well kept, well groomed place to live, but again, very regulated. Now, other thinkers, um, scholars, philosophers were certainly aware of the problem. And I have up here Louis Blanc, The Organization of Labor, 1840. And Blanc pointed very clearly to the problem when you have a glut in the labor market of its effect on wages. He says, you have a factory owner puts up, hiring workers. You have 3 people going up to apply for the job and saying, I'd like to work. And the factory owner says, okay, what would you charge to work for me for a day? So, I'm married with kids. I would need like 3 pence a day. Factory worker says, okay, I'll let you know. Next person comes along, and this is an abstract. This is not an actual case. This is a thought experiment. Okay. Next person comes along and says, and he says, how much would you need to work? He said, well, I don't have any kids, but I'm married, so I need 2.5 pence a day. Okay. And the third person comes along and says, how much would you need? He says, well, I'm single. I'll work for 2 pence a day. Whom is the factory owner going to hire? The single guy for 2 pence a day. That will lower his costs. Because if he hires the married guy, he's going to have to pay 3 pence a day. Now, the problem that Blanc said, this is in France, because the problem was not limited to England by any means. Blanc said, what's going to happen to those other 2 workers and their families, or spouse and then families, if they don't get a job somewhere? Because the lower labor costs will push out the higher costs to support families. They'll have to turn to theft, to perhaps even murder. Well, murder, we just we hang them and we'll get rid of them that way. But that's not a help for society. Theft is not a help for society. Crime is not a help for society. Yeah, we throw them into prison, but that costs the government money too. This is a real problem. And what Blanc suggested, the solution for this, is that the government establish workhouses to provide jobs for the otherwise unemployed, for those whom the factory owners, based on the market, for open market, not free market, but open market, free market because free markets don't exist, but the open market for labor wouldn't hire. The government should step in and establish these workhouses and pay a living wage, and give them projects to do. And that, he said, would then also have the effect of counteracting this attempt by the capitalists to minimize their labor costs. So there would be the competition. It was almost like being restoring competition within the labor market, which would increase wages, which would allow workers to provide for their families. That too is in some ways an approach like Owen's, but Owen's, it was kind of private, these communities that he established, to be established and financed by the capitalists themselves. Blanc said the government should do it, governmental work programs, because that will help the society. Because otherwise, you have significant portions of the population who are turning to crime because they have no means of income. And he doesn't, I mean, it's a long treatise and he has many different writings, but so I don't really know off the top of my head what he dealt with in terms of the conditions of actually those who were hired. So it's not as such that if you get a job, then you're set for life. But the problem was this discrepancy between the open market labor, which decreased wages, and then the attempt for the government to step in to offer government work programs, workhouses, to help the competition so that there would be an equilibrium, working towards an equilibrium of wages, which would allow society to limit, maybe not completely get rid of, but limit the social problems based on unemployment, starving people, homeless people, people who can't support themselves through no fault of their own, basically, or who were injured, because that was the other thing with the faculty. If you got injured in the faculty, uh, in the faculty, there we go. There's a Freudian slip for you. In the factory, me saying faculty, but in the factory, if you were injured, you were just discarded. There was no health provisions. Owen provided for health care, minimal level, but still there to take care of the workers. And so it gets to be a real problem of what to do with these people. And this was Blanc's suggestion. Owen has his suggestion. And it was increasingly realized that something needed to be done. And that then brings me to Karl Marx and communism. Because this entire approach, in Marx's view, of trying to mitigate the abuses of capitalism by social programs, by the socialist program, by socialism, was something that Marx fought against. He says, the socialists, they're just proposing these programs to maintain the capitalists in their positions of power and wealth. They're not addressing the root problem and the root cause, which is the alienation of labor from the products and the fruits of their own labor. And this tension between labor and the capitalists, Marx saw as a fundamental problem in society from the very beginning. The conflict between labor and capital, or let's say the haves and the have-nots, even before the Smith and capitalism. Marx puts it in a broad, grand scheme. Now, who was Marx? Marx was a philosopher. He studied University of Berlin, Bonn, and then Jena, and received his PhD in philosophy from Jena in 1841. This is all a slide. And while working there, he met Friedrich Engels, who was another German, who had similar interests in terms of the working class in England. Engels had written a book on the working class in England. And Marx and Engels kind of hook up and start working together. And so much, Marx gets all the credit, but it's really Marx and Engels working together. And in some ways, Marx's whole approach, because he's a philosopher, he's an academic philosopher. Now, at Jena, or it may have been actually at Berlin, he became associated with Walter Bauer, who was also a university professor, and was pretty controversial in his social philosophies. And because Marx was associated with Bauer, and Bauer was expelled from the university, Marx knew that he didn't really have an academic career that would have been available to him, because he was seen as, no, we put you out because you're associated with Bauer. We don't want Bauer because Bauer is undermining what we're trying to do in society. And the German population at this time grows between 1800 and 1850, grows by 50%. There's a real burgeoning in Germany. Germany. There is no Germany yet. We'll be talking about that next lecture in terms of nationalism and unification of Germany. But the German Empire, the different German states, was not as developed in terms of capitalism and industry as was France and England, especially. So they were kind of behind the times. But this period, 1800 to 1850, there was a real boom and an influx of people. And how do we handle all of this? And what do we do with it? And how do we approach it? And Marx saw this as a social problem that needed philosophical analysis and solutions being proposed. And perhaps the best encapsulation of Marx's whole approach is actually the 11th thesis on Feuerbach. You see up there theses on Feuerbach, which he published in 1848. And the 11th thesis is heretofore, philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point, however, is to change it. That encapsulates Marx's vision and approach. Philosophy, not just to sit back and interpret what we see, speculate on ultimate realities, but how do we change the world based on our philosophical study? He and Engels started working for a newspaper, and they later founded another newspaper, the Rheinische Zeitung, or like the Rhineland's Daily. And then they ended up moving to London, and from London they published the new Rhineland Daily, the Neue Rheinische Zeitschrift. And a number of papers that were later published, and not really published until 1923, but were written in the course of 1846 or so, and then when they were published and gathered together after Marx had died, and Engels too, under the title The German Ideology. And here we really see the philosophical structure of what became known as Marxism, or at least I shouldn't say that, what became known as Marx's positions, because there's a big distinction between Marx and Marxism. Marx argued that there is a fundamental law of history. Now I have up there historical German ideology of the young Hegelian, historical materialism opposed to historical idealism. When I talk about young Hegelian, that's referring to Marx, because there was a whole movement referred to as the young Hegelians. Hegel. Hegel was one of the leading philosophers of the 19th century Germany. A brilliant mind. He's still influential. And he looked at history as a whole. I mean, he looked at a lot of different things. He developed this idea of historical idealism, where these great ideas are what moves history. And Hegel, drawing in some ways from the scholastic tradition coming out of the medieval universities, so that there is an ongoing dialectic. Now, dialectic is a different word because it's not quite the same as logic, but it is going a back and forth, a dialect, a dialogue. So what we see is a thesis, and then we have an opposing antithesis, and the solution is then a synthesis that then is met, or that becomes a new thesis, opposed by another antithesis, which yields a new synthesis. And it's this ongoing process of thesis, antithesis, synthesis that becomes a new thesis that is countered by a new antithesis that provides a new, that explains the whole human development based on ideas and the structure of ideas. And Hegel had this idea of this explains all of history, and we can construct a universal history based on historical idealism. Now, the young Hegelians, which are simply the followers of Hegel, so the students of Hegel, are two factions. One kind of more following Hegel in that more kind of, let's say, conservative approach, because we're still here in the synthesis thesis position. We're kind of wary of the antithesis. And then the other faction was the left faction, the radical faction that, let's say, took the antithesis position, and that was Marx's position of we need to oppose the whole structure of historical idealism. And what Marx said is not historical idealism, it is historical materialism. Because what really determines history is material goods, economics, who controls the wealth. We see this in ancient societies, throughout medieval Christendom, into early modern Europe, and into modern Europe, and here we are It's all can be understood based on the conflict between, let's say, the haves and the have-nots, those who are in charge of the means of production and labor. And always before, labor was part of production. If you have artisans in an artisan society, if you have a blacksmith makes the shoes, makes the and then sells them, and reaps the fruit of their own labor, their own art and craft. What was happening in Germany in the 19th century, early 19th century, and what was happening in England and France as a result of industrialization, a lot of these arts or skills or crafts became centralized and capitalized by factories, whereby your blacksmith then became a wage laborer working for a capitalist and no longer was in charge of his own production. And this growing wealth gap for Marx was the driving factor of history based on material goods. Economics is the foundation, is the basis. Everything else is simply superstructure. That we can understand the theology, philosophy of medieval Christendom based on the means of production, the feudal society, agricultural society, who's in charge, who isn't. We can understand the whole system based on the economics and the economic structures of a given society and culture. Later, Engels, who often served as a spokesperson for Marx, I have a great quote from him later on too. But in an interview, he said once, he said, no, we're not saying that philosophy, theology, ethics, whatever doesn't matter. The superstructure, because we've never said that. All we're saying is it's the basis, the foundation, the economic foundation of economic conditions that makes the superstructure possible, so that the superstructure reflects the material conditions of the economics as we move through history. And instead of this thesis, antithesis, synthesis, we have the conflict between those who own the capital and those who are working. And especially with industrialization, we see this increasing divorce from labor being divorced and alienated from its own production. And we see this too in the French Revolution. That same kind of approach. Now, Marx divided society into three classes, three orders. You see where that idea comes from. The nobility, the bourgeoisie, the nobility / aristocracy, the bourgeoisie, and the proletariat. The nobility, aristocracy was what we usually think of it as, but for Marx, it's really the high level capitalists, those who own all the capital. The bourgeoisie, which is just the citizens, or the wealthy artisans who also own capital and hire labor. And the proletariat was the common man, everybody else, the laborers, the working class, was the proletariat. And what Marx argued was that the French Revolution was a revolution of the bourgeoisie against the nobility aristocracy. It was the bourgeois revolution. And even though we have images of peasants storming the Bastille and all that, they were involved. What really drove the French Revolution was the bourgeoisie. And we can see that because what did it end up with? It ended up with Napoleon. Let's say a bourgeois emperor. The workers were still excluded. Now, you'll read too in your book about the revolutions of 1848, because it's this revolutionary context of, again, the increasing population and what do we do about the social structures that was the context of Marx's thoughts and ideas. And he was appalled by how the common man was being oppressed, including restrictions on gathering firewood in forests, which had been going all the way back to peasant revolts in the Middle Ages. That was the issue, because he said, how can this be? So he proposed this historical materialism to Hegel's historical idealism. And it became expressed most famously and most well known in terms of Marx, in his pamphlet, in some ways, of 1848, known as the Communist Manifesto. The Communist Manifesto. Because Marx did not invent communism. What he did was make a clear distinction between communism and socialism, because there were French communists before Marx. Leblanc was close to being one, who said, like, these social programs, socialism, aren't going far enough. We need to really make it based on communal understanding. Get back to that Christian ideal of community and the apostolic community. And Marx said, these people, the socialists, don't go far enough. And my biggest opponent are the socialists, because they are just candy coating the problem. They're trying to appease the workers, the proletariat, for their own benefit, so they can maintain their position as capitalists and continue their exploitation, even though it's not now, with socialism, as obvious the harmful effects. So what we need to do is gather together the forces standing opposed to socialism into a movement that has a focus and a character. And that's how the Communist Manifesto begins. The specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. Specter is a ghost, a spirit. Now, the Communist Manifesto, I wish I thought about assigning the whole thing. I wanted to give you more of a general taste of some of Marx's works. The Communist Manifesto is a call to arms, is a call to wake up. And it ends with the exhortation, workers of the world, unite. Because Marx recognized something. If the proletariat really grasped its own power, it could bring about change. It could bring about change to society. The problem is it has to come to a class consciousness first. Because individual proletariats, they're never going to get it. So you have to realize a class. Just think about if every wage worker, everyone who just is paid wages or a salary, not the people who are owning things, but if all the workers in the United States tomorrow went on strike based on the common understanding of we form a group because we are all wage laborers, what do you think would happen? We have problems with the writer's strike in Hollywood. We have problems with the United Auto Workers strike. That caused a great deal of, oh my God, what do we do? What happened if every wage laborer went on strike? That's the power that Marx saw. But they would have to see, okay, we've seen these issues and strikes, and do you join the picket line? Do you join the strikes? Do you join a union or not? And attempts to bust up unions, which is simply a way of saying, no, we don't want to pay you as much as you're being demanded to pay. Now, the argument is, we can't afford that, so we'll go out of business, and that's not good for anybody. Great, but the whole issue is what we're doing is not good for society either. Now, I'm not trying to talk about today. I'm just using that as an analogy. That was Marx's point in terms of workers of the world unite because of the power of coming to consciousness. Because they said what happened with the revolution, the French Revolution, and also the revolutions of 1848 were simply bourgeois revolutions. The revolution of the proletariat would be coming. And what it would do would be establish a classless society. Property would be held in common. Now, Marx was rather fiercely anti-religious. And yet, he's famous for saying religion is the opium of the people, because he viewed it as a means of the aristocracy, the bourgeoisie, and the nobility to keep the proletariat in line. That was part of the superstructure of the fundamental economic basis and foundation. So this is the opiate of the people. In some ways, it's going back to Plato and the end of the myth of Why should we tell these stories of the afterlife and punishments and rewards in the afterlife, because Plato thought that was a bunch of hooey, but it serves a purpose for the common people who can't really understand the whole structure of the just society. So to follow the rules, we tell them this pious myth about you better be a good citizen and do what you're told, or you're going to suffer hell in the afterlife. And then with Christianity, literally hell, Sheol, and Judaism, and so on. And Marx says that is part of it. It's the opiate of the people to keep them from coming to their own class consciousness of their own power. Now, Marx exhorted the workers of the world with his Communist Manifesto. This is our manifesto. We can establish this. His classless society was, though, very much based on the monastic ideal of the original apostolic community. Where do we find the original communist community? Acts 4:32 through 31 through 32, where it's like the apostles all lived together and kept everything in common, distributing each to his need. That was the monastic idea throughout the Middle Ages, the later Middle Ages on. That is the way it should be structured for a Christian society. We should take care of each other based on need and pool our resources all together. The communal movements from the communes in the 1960s and so were tried to go back to that ideal too, sometimes based on Christian ideals as well, that we're going to form this little society, pooling our resources, going back, living like the original apostolic community. And, now, Marx's idea was definitely not Christian, but that idea of a classless society where everything was held in common and distributed according to need was what he saw as the culmination of an historical development of historical materialism that started with the origins of civilization. And what would happen would be when the proletariat finally came to class consciousness and understood its power, it would bring about the proletariat revolution, which would establish this classless society, and there would be peace and harmony and prosperity for all. Because the problem is the conflict and the disparity of wealth, who has it and who doesn't. If you think back on Hobbes' state of nature I talked about, where every individual is their own sovereign. What was the state of nature for Hobbes? Yeah, you can do whatever you want. Perfect freedom. So if you want something, you can just go and get it and take it. But if someone's there saying, oh, I'm going to get it first, you say, no, you're not. I'm going to get it. They said, no, I'm going to get it. That person's going to beat the crap out of you if they can, or you're going to have to beat the crap out of them if you can. And it's so much the survival of the fittest where the strongest emerges. And that is where, when Hobbes said, in that kind of a state of nature, which is idealized, he said, he didn't posit that as ever a real state. Life is nasty, poor, brutish, and short. Because of the issue that competition is not perfect. Hobbes knew that. Because even though we all might have individual rights, individual sovereignty, if we start to exercise those, we're not all of the same strength, the same physique. Once there's a little difference, once we get an advantage, and if I get, if I have $2 and you have $1, I can do more with my $2 than you can with your $1. Then I can do a little bit more. And that inequality is a source of social conflict, individual conflict, and the exploitation of the haves of the have-nots, or in terms of Marx in 19th century socialism, communism, of the capitalists, their exploitation of labor. And that was the problem. Exploiting the labor, and this gap between the haves and the have-nots. And Marx says, once the proletariat recognizes its situation, comes to class consciousness, it will overthrow the bourgeois, who are already overthrown the nobility/aristocracy. It'll all be good. But for that to happen, the workers of the world must unite. It's a call to consciousness. It's not a call to arms. Now, Marx's really magnum opus is not the Communist Manifesto, but his 3-volume study, Das Kapital, or Capital, which he wrote when he was in London, beginning in 1864. And it's here where he, in terms of the political economy and philosophy and economics, and how do those all work together? Philosophy, politics, and economics, political theory, economic theory. That's where he really lays out Das Kapital in 3 volumes. It's very, it's dense, it's difficult. Um, Obviously, Marx scholars read it, but people don't read Das Kapital, even in the translation. They don't read it, and because it's thick and long and difficult. I mean, I haven't read it. I've looked at it, but I haven't read it. Looked through it. That is really where he puts forward all of his ideas together in one place. Now, what happened, and some of the problem was that Marx, especially after the Communist Manifesto, Workers of the World Unite, there were groups who seized on Marx's ideas. They said, yes, Karl Marx, we agree with you. We are going to bring about this proletariat revolution. We're going to make it happen. And we have groups who start identifying themselves as Marxist. They're from the Marxists, the Marxism. They're trying to affect and bring about Marx's theories of this dialectical historical materialism and calling for the consciousness of the proletariat to come to consciousness. They said, we are going to, put this into practice. And there we see this quote, which I'm going to end with, Marx and Marxism. The distinction is Engels, after Marx's death, so in 1890, because Marx dies in 1883, replying to C. Schmidt, and actually I'm not sure who C. Schmidt was. I'm sorry, I should have looked that up. Reported on Marx's view of what he was hearing towards his death about all these groups of Marxists, especially in France and in Paris, trying to bring about social revolution. And Engels said, you know what? When Marx said, when he told him about what was going on, what was being done in his name, so to speak, he said, all I know is that I am not a Marxist. There's a huge distinction between Karl Marx's own theories and philosophies as articulated in Das Kapital, and then what became of his ideas as they were attempted to be implemented in society, and then with the Russian Revolution, especially with Lenin, as they were forcefully put into practice. For Marx, it was simply a natural historical process. Yes, he's calling for workers of the world to unite. Yes, he said, wake up and realize the power that you have to come to this class consciousness. But what happens if, before that comes about, before the proletariat all wake up and unite, if you start, it's simply, he doesn't address this explicitly, but he would say, it's simply then the bourgeoisie enforcing its will for more exploitation of the common man, because it's not ready yet. It is, if we start to say we're going to institute communal property before the proletariat revolution and the rise of class consciousness, it's simply another, it's just like almost like the socialists, another means of the bourgeoisie or the ruling class controlling the proletariat. And what do we see with the Soviet Union? What do we see in China? This very much attempt of those in power to keep the proletariat in line. Because again, what would happen? How many Chinese are there in China? If the common man in China rose up against Xi Jinping altogether, we know what happened in Tiananmen Square. I know you're probably maybe too young. I was watching it on TV. This revolt, and it was brutally put down. But if the entire nation rose up, what would happen? If the entire Russian population rose up against Putin, what would happen? If the entire American population rose up against this government, what would happen? Marx, it was a natural historical process. In that sense, he was Hegelian in that there was this overarching goal of history. where it was all progressing. We can call for a recognition of it, but we can't force it until it's ready. That's some of the distinctions. Now, Marx is not Marxist. Marxism is not, it's not the only form of communism, but it's a predominant form of communism. It's certainly not Marx. I mean, even though Soviet communism was based on Marx's ideas, it's really, as I said, not a perversion of Marx, but a warping of Marx's theories and powers. Marx was an activist. He was a philosopher and an academic, but he was not advocating openly putting these things into practice until society was ready. Now, I said the challenge of Marx. Marx, in some ways, his theories are utopian in that he envisions this ideal society, a classless society of peace and harmony and prosperity for everyone when we're all together and when property is all held in common. Private property. So that's one thing. That's one of the definitions. So I can give you a one-line definition of my view of communism: the abolition of private property. That's a challenge because what was, according to Locke, one of the fundamental human rights, the rights of life, liberty, and property. So in some ways, we see Marx's ideas as challenging the very ideas of the Enlightenment themselves, even though as he was himself a product of the Enlightenment and of Hegelian thought, kind of as it develops on into the 19th century in Germany. So there's this struggle. Do we follow a Locke Declaration of Independence, Declaration of the Rights of Man view of the bourgeois society based on property, and then Adam Smith, laissez-faire capitalism, or do we say no, that produces abuses and horrors? Or do we have this vision of the perfect society where everything is held in common? That's what utopias are always formulated as critique of society, and that's what we need to see that Marx is, from Communist Manifesto, his other writings, as well as Das Kapital, asserted his ideas as a way of critiquing the society in which he found himself and the problems that were there. Now, the challenge of Marx is to realize, how do we accept this and use it without forcing it, as did the Soviets, etc.? Or should we even just forget it because it is utopian? Well, in so many ways, Adam Smith's view was utopian, this idea of perfect competition and the guiding hand. Oh, really? Where have we ever seen that actually work? The impotence of the majority. Marx argued, workers of the world unite in the class consciousness of the proletariat. How do how does one counter that? Emphasizing individualism. Because if you emphasize individualism and your own, that goes back to the Hobbesian view, there's not going to be class consciousness because the individual is saying what's good for me. Marx is what's good for everybody. Focus on individualism, including individual human rights, is based on what is good for me. And that is a way to splinter and dissipate the potential for the proletariat coming to class consciousness. If we see the rise, as I'll be talking about in other lectures later on too, the increasing rise of individualism and what I will call a hyper-individualism, of course, from beginning in like 1980s and thereafter, this focus on me, and what is good for me, and what do I want, and how can I get what I want, that leads to disintegration of any sense of social cohesion. And Marx stands up as a challenge over that. How do we balance? How do we deal with it? And two, in terms of Marx, it always brings about this fear of change. I talked about the young Hegelians and the two different avenues, let's say the conservatives and the radicals. The conservatives are the ones who are afraid of change because change is scary. Change is politically, I'm not a conservative, but I'm conservative in terms of I still don't like the iPhone. I can't stand my phone. I still not really all that crazy about computers. I see a lot of the advantages, but I think it's is it all that we lived for how long? Just went to graduate school and started just using a typewriter. So I kind of fear technological development, even though I can put it in perspective and say, okay, yeah, I also benefited in what I thought was quote unquote just the way things were was actually based on a whole series of technological developments I just had kind of grown up with. And so, when you grow up with computers and things, you view the world differently. But my only point in saying this, I think as humans, we by nature resist change. And what Marx was advocating for, not trying to affect so much as advocating for the requisite consciousness that would lead to change. And especially when you have people in positions of power and authority, we don't want to give that up. And so we fear any attempt that might, or even a perceived threat to our own positions of power. And communism and Marx's views were that. So we cannot allow that to take place. And we can argue that by saying it goes against you, my fellow people, because it denies your rights, it denies your individualism. That's the tension and the challenge. Now, helping to stave off that threat of individualism and the threat of the proletariat, we have the power of the myth and the nation and national identity. If we can build a national identity so that the common man, the proletariat, will then identify with the nation state rather than with each other. That too is a way to ward off the eventual coming to class consciousness of the proletariat. Workers of the world unite. No, this is like workers are working for Germany, are working for France, or working for the United States, or working for Britain, because it's the British workers, it's the American workers. Co-opting the proletariat into the myth of the nation state is a means of guarding against the potentiality of the proletarian revolution that Marx was saying was a historical almost inevitability at some point when the proletariat came to class consciousness and did unite. It would then affect the classless society. We don't want the classless society because if we're the upper classes, we want to maintain our position. So if we can use the myth of the nation state as the basis of individual identity, that's good for everybody. We'll be talking about nationalism in the next lecture. And this all gets at the relationship between the individual and society and what brings about historical change. Because whether we like it or not, whether we're afraid of it or not, history changes because it progresses every minute, every second, every instant, every week, every year, every decade. And the only way to get that to stop is death. We are all approaching death. Just a fact. That every second we live, we are one second closer to our death, whatever that might be. Change comes about the entire time. I'm very different than I was a year ago. I was very different than I was, 40 years ago. Change is inevitable. The problem is, what do we do about it? How do we handle it? And somehow we still want to have something that stays the same, that we feel that we can, have a firm foundation because the world is shifting under our feet. So we need somewhere to hold on to deal with the waves of change. And whether that is a conservative something of the way it used to be, in our views, or whether it's a liberal ideal of this utopian view of only if we can have this idea and bring it about, that gives us a place to stand. Because that liberal view is like change is coming and we need it to be even more and affect it so we can mitigate the fear of what's going to happen based on our model trying to force change to be what we want it to be. As opposed to the conservative view of we are going to fight against change because we like the way things are in our own view of things. And that struggle between realizing how to deal with historical change and our place in it is really the process of coming to historical consciousness. Hans-Georg Gadamer, one of my favorite philosophers, um, talked about the historically affected consciousness, which is a very difficult term to translate into the German term into English, but that's how it has been translated as the historically affected consciousness. That our very understanding and consciousness is shaped and conditioned by historical developments and where we are in this overarching historical process as change keeps happening. Was Marx right? Because are not our consciousness themselves based on where our position in the world? Just think of, how people living in houses along Meridian Street between, let's say, 42nd Street and 71st Street, those mansions. How is their world different from people who live on, houses on Keystone between 16th Street and 40th Street? Their entire worlds are different. Their consciousnesses are different. Their education and backgrounds are different. Is it not that the material conditions and economic conditions of where we are shape and inform our understandings of ourselves, of humanity, and of history? Is not our own historical consciousness conditioned by our material situation that has historical developments going all the way back? How do we understand ourselves? And that is why history is so important a discipline to study, because it offers us perspective, not just on what happened, but on ourselves, who we are, where we are in the world, in the society. And that's what this is all about. And that's what this lecture was about. And that's what this course is about. So now I've gone from the specific to the grandiose, and we'll be coming back there as we go through things. Next lecture, we start talking about nationalism and this attempt to, let's say, counter, not necessarily consciously, but counter the threat of Marx, the challenge and threat of Marx and Marx's perspectives with nation state and the increasing development of the myth of the nation state with the emergence of nationalism in the 19th century, which then would lead to the world wars, and on we go. But we'll get there when we get there. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.